Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an introductory reader by Stephen Kahn. And in this video, I will be going over Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail and comparing it to Plato's dialogues, the Apology and the Crito, or the defense of Socrates and the Crito. In this letter from a Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King mentions Socrates 3 times. In our book, it's page 471, 473, and 474. And he alludes to Plato's famous cave allegory a few times, and 2 of those times are page 477 and 479. So we'll be going over all the comparisons with Plato after I give an overview of this reading, which is one of the longer ones. It's about 10 pages. All right, so the letter was written on April 16, 1963, from a jail in Birmingham, Alabama. And Martin Luther King is responding to a letter written by some fellow clergymen who were upset about the civic disobedience movement that MLK was leading. So I'm just going to start from there. He says on page 469, "My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling our present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom, if ever, do I pause to answer criticisms of my work and ideas." He says if he did that, his secretaries would be engaged in just responding to criticisms all the time. "But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms." So that he's speaking there in a way that is very much like Socrates. He's saying, let's patiently and reasonably discuss the situation, which is something that is not often the case in the general world of politics, especially in a democracy, as we saw Socrates say according to Plato. All right, so continuing here, on page 470, left-hand column, "I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia." So he's saying a local affiliate in Birmingham invited him over to engage in a nonviolent direct action program. So he was saying, I'm not a foreigner, I was invited. And even if I'm not from Birmingham, Alabama, I'm an American. So you can't call me an outside infiltrator. I was invited here by a resident, and furthermore, we're all Americans. So he was just responding to that outside agitator accusation. So, and then a little bit lower, 470, "Beyond this, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here." And then he's now going to compare himself to the early Christian martyrs, including St. Paul. So, "Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their 'Thus saith the Lord' far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and city of the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my particular hometown." So, there he is. I'm not an outsider, and even if I was, just like Jesus and just like Paul carried Jesus' message all around the Roman Empire, I'm carrying the gospel of freedom all over the world, so I'm not disturbed by accusations that I am an outsider. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Okay, so we're going to see Plato says a lot of similar things. So I'm just going to overview the entire letter, pointing out some key points, and I'm going to be focusing more on the general concepts because this is an introductory to philosophy class, not so much on the details of history, but I will be reading through them. So he's saying now, "You deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham, but I am sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstration into being. I am sure that each of you would want to go beyond the superficial social analyst who looks merely at effects and does not grapple with understanding causes. Okay, so he's saying you left the Negro community with no other alternatives. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. This is page 470, right-hand column. Number 1, collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive. 2, negotiation. 3, self-purification. And 4, direct action. So we've gone through all of these steps, and he's saying now this is what we're doing. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of police brutality is known in every section of this country. Its unjust treatment of Negroes in the courts is a notorious reality. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than any city in this nation. These are the hard, brutal, and unbelievable facts. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers. But the political leaders consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation. I'm going to be comparing that to Plato's Crito later on. So then he gets into some of the details where he asked the merchants of the city of Birmingham to take down the race signs. He doesn't say specifically what they said, but it was basically whites eat here, coloreds eat there. So they had an agreement with the merchants that they would take those signs down. So on the basis of these promises, Reverend Shuttlesworth and the leaders of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights agreed to call a moratorium on any type of demonstrations. As the weeks and months unfolded, the signs remained. There was a broken promise. They had blasted hopes, and dark shadow of a deep disappointment settled upon us, and so they decided on direct action. We decided to go through a process of self-purification. We had workshops on nonviolence saying, are you able to take people yelling horrible things at you and assaulting you physically and not fighting back? That was there, and to examine their own consciences. He says, we decided to set our direct action program on the Easter season, because that's next to Christmas, the largest shopping period of the year, to put pressure on the merchants for the needed changes. But then an election came up, and Mr. Connor was in the runoff. They wanted him defeated. The person who took his place, Mr. Boutwell, was much more articulate and gentle than Mr. Connor. They are both segregationists, though, so dedicated to the task of maintaining the status quo. After Mr. Connor was defeated, this more gentle segregationist came in, which MLK wanted, but still, despite the fact that a more moderate individual was elected, that's when they began their nonviolent direct action, because they knew that the guy wasn't going to change segregation. He was better than the other one. He was less rabid, but he was not going to change anything. So they got the less rabid segregationist in, and then they began their nonviolent protest movement, which was marching in the streets and sit-ins at lunch counters to be served at the white lunch counters, and it was for those things that Martin Luther King was arrested and put in jail, and he's writing from the jail, which is very similar to Socrates speaking from the jail in the Crito. Okay, so I want to now get into some of the psychological tactics that MLK talks about. On the bottom of 471, left-hand column, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to so dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I just referred to the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, we must see the need of having nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men to rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So the purpose of the direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in the tragic attempt to live in monologue rather than dialogue. He calls it his beloved Southland. You know, that's a strange thing for someone who's living in a segregated society that had just emerged from slavery 100 years earlier. Still, he loves the Southland. It's similar to the way Socrates loves Athens, despite the fact that they put him to death, as we'll discuss later. All right, so then he explains why didn't they give this new administration with Mr. Boutwell time to act, and he's like, because the history is, this is 471, the right-hand column at the bottom, history is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups are more immoral than individuals. I hope I said that philosopher or theologian's name correctly, but I looked up that name on Wikipedia, and he's a theologian who is probably most famous for the prayer. I'm going to, here it is over here. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I used to have to say that at high school, St. John's College High School in Washington, D.C. back in the 80s. That's why I was like, oh, okay, I do know who this person is. All right, so I'm going back to this video. And, all right, but that's an important philosophical point, that groups are more immoral than individuals. That is Socrates definitely had that same opinion, as we'll be going over later. Carl Jung, the psychologist, talks about that as well. It seems as if the sense of moral responsibility is in an inverse proportion to the size of the group. If there's 100 people and that group decides to do something evil, each individual feels a lot less responsible than if they did it all by themselves. So, but Martin Luther King is talking here about, you know, the majority, which is the white majority in the South. They are not, as a group, very moral. They're not going to give up this idea of the privilege that they have. So they need direct action, even though they have a more polite segregationist in office still. They need this pressure. And he uses the word pressure and tension a lot. That's what he's creating for the sake of creating a dialogue and a negotiation. He wants to talk, but the power structure refuses to talk, and thus he has to create a scene, a dramatic scene. He's openly saying, this is what I'm doing here. So 472, the left-hand column, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given up by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Skipping down a little, this wait, meaning wait and just hold on a little while, this wait has almost always meant never. It has been a tranquilizing thalidomide, relieving the emotional stress for a moment only to give birth to an ill-formed infant of frustration. We must come to see with the distinguished jurist of yesterday that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional God-given rights. Let me just stop there. I did the math. 340 minus 1963 equals 1623. I believe that's when Jamestown in Virginia was established, and that was the first African brought over as a slave. I believe that's the case. I should have checked it out, but I want to get this video done here on August 28th in commemoration of the March on Washington from August 28th, 1963, which was 4 months after Martin Luther King wrote this letter, and it just so happened it fell on this day. I was like, oh, that's a good, seemingly meaningful coincidence. So more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. That's how long they've been waiting. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward the goal of political independence, and we still creep at a horse and buggy pace toward the gaining of a cup of coffee at the lunch counter. I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in the airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her little eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the depressing clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, and see her begin to distort her little personality by unconsciously developing a bitterness toward white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son asking in agonizing pathos, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" And he goes on, and he says, "Then the cup of endurance runs over." So, having read that, the most powerful phrase for me was, having a 7-year-old daughter, was when he sees tears welling up in her little eyes when she's told that Funtown is closed to colored children. I mean, that was pretty harsh. So, and then he goes on, there's horrible, horrible things were going on in Birmingham, Alabama, and this is what he wrote about. So, on the right-hand column, 472, you express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. It is rather strange and paradoxical to find us consciously breaking laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? This is going to be the crucial philosophical question of the Crito, as we'll see later. The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just and there are unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine when a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Okay, so Martin Luther King Jr. had a PhD in theology. He was an academic, and so he's referring to St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, two of the most important theologians in the Catholic Church, in the Christian tradition. There was no Protestant church at the time of either of those saints. And so and we're going to read St. Thomas Aquinas in our book. I'd like to make another video at some point discussing Martin Luther King's reference to St. Thomas Aquinas and what this whole business of eternal and natural law, but there's so much to cover by comparing the letter from a Birmingham jail to the Apology and the Crito that I'm not going to get into the details of that right now. All right, so continuing on 473, any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because the segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. This is very similar to what Socrates says, as described by Plato. And St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas both refer to Plato. The Catholic cosmology and much of the philosophy underlying the theology was taken from Plato, which Martin Luther King was certainly well aware of that. He mentioned Socrates and Jesus together, as we'll see later. So he knew that this was a connection. So again, any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. So he's concerned with unjust laws, not just for the damage that it's doing to black Americans, which is obvious, and that's his main concern, but he's also concerned for the white segregationists because it's damaging their soul. To allow them to live this sinful life is harmful to their greater good, which is the good of the soul, which is another thing Socrates reiterated, especially in the Apology. Not so much in the Crito, because Crito wasn't so sure about the existence of the soul. All right, continuing here on the left-hand column, 473. Let us turn to a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal. On the other hand, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. A little lower down on that column, these are just a few examples of unjust and just laws. There are some instances when a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I was arrested Friday on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there's nothing wrong with an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but when the ordinance is used to preserve segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and peaceful protest, then it becomes unjust. I hope you can see the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law as the rabid segregationist would do. This would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly. All right, he goes on to talk about the white mothers in New Orleans who were screaming horrible things at the children in the schools. He says, and with a willingness to accept the penalty, I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law. Very similar to Plato's dialogue, the Crito. That's what Socrates is telling his friend Crito. I need to stay in jail even though this was an unjust decision. I don't want to create anarchy and destroy the city by disobeying the laws. All right, so continuing, of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. He's going to go on to mention Socrates directly. It was seen sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar because a higher moral law was involved. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks before submitting to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. So now you know why I really want to compare this to what we've already covered. All right, so then he goes on to say, we can never forget everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. So there's breaking the law. If the law is unjust, well, you got to be patient and use the proper methods. And then he's just pointing out, you can have severe Hitler rounding up Jews because they're Jewish and executing them was legal according to the state laws. Well, actually, I don't think they openly admitted to mass murder, but at any rate, rounding up Jews for being Jewish was legal. So breaking a law like that, is that really unjust? That's where it starts to get philosophical. It's like, well, it's an unjust law, but it is a law, and if you break a law, then you're undermining the power of law in general. But even Socrates would say, I would not obey an unjust law to tell me to stop philosophizing. I'd break that one and willingly die. So if you want to kill me for it, I'm not going to resist arrest, but I'm not going to obey that law. So, okay, so then, so at the bottom there, he says, first, I must confess that over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. I'm skipping a little bit. Who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail to do this, they become dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension of the South is merely a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace, where the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight, to a substance-filled positive peace, where all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. Then he says we have to expose the pustulence of this horrible injustice to the fresh air and sun of public opinion. over on the right-hand column, 474 at the top. Isn't this like condemning? All right, so they're saying, let me go back, left-hand column. In your statement, you asserted that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But can this assertion be logically made? Isn't this like condemning the robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical delvings precipitated the misguided popular mind to make him drink the hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never-ceasing devotion to his will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? We must come to see, as federal courts have consistently affirmed, that it is immoral to urge an individual to withdraw his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest precipitates violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. So the violence that he's talking about was coming from the white crowd in the South who would surround these nonviolent marches. The marches that are happening in 2020, the violence of the people who are protesting Martin Luther King would say that's not the way to go about it. Now, some people might say, well, it is. That the tension and pressure you talk about that are required, that's a good idea, but we need to amp up that tension and that pressure after a certain amount of time. But at any rate, some people claim that, there's peaceful marchers in the street, but then tagging along with them or an unruly element. But what Martin Luther King is talking about here, the unruly, violent element, were the counter-protesters who were the majority surrounding these people, just so that, it doesn't get historically mixed up here. That their accusation was, you're causing violence, but the violence was brought on the protesters. It wasn't them breaking things and looting or attacking people. That would happen later in 1968 after Martin Luther King was assassinated. But at any rate, in this, just to keep the parallels clear with Socrates and the Crito, and that's what he did. He says, wouldn't that be like blaming Socrates, accusing him of inciting murder because the majority of the Athenians sentenced him to death? I mean, that's ludicrous to say that. All right, so on the right-hand column, 474, near the bottom, we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of men willing to be co-workers with God, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. So he's saying the time is now, put the pressure on, create the tension, to force a dialogue with this power structure, to get them to obey the laws against segregation. That's what he's saying. And then he goes on to give some practical political advice about his position in the realm of black protesters. So 475 on the left. I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the Negro community. One is a force of complacency made up of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, have been so completely drained of self-respect and a sense of somebodyness that they have adjusted to segregation, and a few Negroes in the middle class who profit by it. All right, that's on one side. The other force is one of bitterness and hatred and comes perilously close to advocating violence. It is expressed in the various black nationalist groups that are springing up over the nation, the largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. This movement is nourished by the contemporary frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination. It is made up of people who have lost faith in America and who have absolutely repudiated Christianity and who have concluded that the white man is an incurable devil. I have tried to stand between these two forces, saying that we need not follow the do-nothingism of the complacent or the hatred and despair of the black nationalist. There is the more excellent way of love and nonviolent protest. I'm grateful to God that through the Negro Church, the dimension of nonviolence entered our struggle. If this philosophy had not emerged, I am convinced that by now many streets of the South would be flowing with floods of blood, and I am further convinced that if our white brothers dismiss as rabble-rousers and outside agitators those of us who are working through the channels of nonviolent direct action and refuse to support our nonviolent efforts, millions of Negroes, out of frustration and despair, will seek solace and security in black nationalist ideologies, a development that will lead inevitably to a frightening racial nightmare. Okay, so this is a pretty powerful writing here. I'm just going to continue to read on 475. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The urge for freedom will eventually come. This is what happened to the American Negro. Something within us has reminded him of his birthright of freedom. Something without has reminded him that he can gain it consciously and unconsciously. He has been swept in by what the Germans called the Zeitgeist, the worldview. And with his black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, he is moving with a sense of cosmic urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. Recognizing this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, one should readily understand public demonstrations. The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations. He has to get them out. So let him march sometime. Let him have his prayer pilgrimages to the City Hall. Understand why he must have sit-ins and freedom rides. If his repressed emotions do not come out in these nonviolent ways, they will come out in ominous expressions of violence. This is not a threat. It is a fact of history. This discontent, he's saying, it needs to be channelized through creative nonviolent action. So then he goes on to say, people call me an extremist. At first I didn't like it, but then I thought, wait a minute. Wasn't Jesus Christ an extremist of love? Love your enemies. Was not Martin Luther King an extremist? Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? This nation cannot survive half slave and half free. Was not Thomas Jefferson an extremist? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. So he says we should be extremists for love, and he reiterates Jesus Christ was an extremist for love. So again, he's a minister, a Christian minister. That's his profession. And so his nonviolence is rooted in the Negro church, he says, and the gospel of nonviolence preached by Jesus Christ, which Socrates also preaches in the Crito, although paradoxically he also says if your nation tells you to go fight a war, you go fight it, regardless of whether you think it's just or not. Martin Luther King did not agree with that. He says war is also bad. Okay, so then he says, all right, but the majority of white moderates don't really act. They say, wait, in time, things will happen. But then he mentions there are a few who have come out of the from behind the anesthetizing security of the stained glass windows out onto the nameless streets of the South and the filthy cockroach-infested jails where the police looked on the white sympathizers as, there's all sorts of epithets here I'm not going to use, but you can assume what they were calling everybody in those jails all the time. And he says, I commend the Catholic leaders of the state for integrating Spring Hill College several years ago. But despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. And he says, it's not that I'm a negative critic. I love the church. I was nurtured in its bosom. I shall always, be true to the church, but he's saying too many ministers are not actively speaking out against this blatant and horrible, unbelievable injustice that's going on in the South. So he says, my fellow white ministers should help be a channel to the white power structure to say, hey, look, the Negro is your brother. What are you doing here? But instead, they're condemning Martin Luther King, and that's why he's writing the letter. He says, you fellow men of the cloth, don't you see what I'm doing is just? Don't you see that this is what God wants as his argument here? So on the left-hand column, 477, in the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I've heard so many ministers say, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. And I've watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion which made a strange distinction between body and soul, the sacred and the secular. Okay, there's going to be a big contrast with Socrates. Socrates definitely was in favor of the theory that the soul lives on after the body, whereas Martin Luther King is saying, no, the body and the soul are united, therefore this racial injustice based on the color of a person's skin covering their body is directly related to the soul. You can't separate the two. That's a really big philosophical question that we can come back to. But he goes on to say, I think this is some good imagery. So here we are moving toward the exit of the 20th century with the religious community largely adjusted to the status quo, standing as a tail light behind other community agencies rather than a headlight leading men to higher levels of justice. So this is going to be a reference to the cave allegory. 477 up at the top. Where were their voices of support when tired, bruised, and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest? A little lower, he says, there was a time when the church was very powerful. It was during that period when the early Christians rejoiced when they were deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. But they went on with the conviction that they were a colony of heaven and had to obey God rather than men, even though they were called disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. They brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contest. Okay, so continuing on the 478 left-hand column, I am meeting young people every day whose disappointment with the church has risen to outright disgust. A little lower, maybe I must turn my faith to the inner spiritual church, the church within the church, as the true ecclesia and the hope of the world. But again, I am thankful to God that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in the struggle for freedom. Lower on 478, we will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our foreparents labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king, and they built the homes of their masters in the midst of brutal injustice and shameful humiliation, and yet out of a bottomless vitality they continue to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelty of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom, because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. All right, so then he'll go on to talk about the brutality of the police in Birmingham, noting that they did show discipline when the cameras were watching them, but if you could see what they were doing in the jail, you'd have another opinion. He says, I don't believe you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its angry, violent dogs literally biting 6 unarmed, non-violent Negroes. I don't believe you would so quickly commend the policemen if you would observe their ugly and inhuman treatment of Negroes here in the city jail, if you would watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls, if you would see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys, if you will observe them, as they did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together. I'm sorry that I can't join you in your praise for the police department. It is true that they have been rather disciplined in their public handling of the demonstrators. In this sense, they may have been rather publicly nonviolent. But for what purpose? To preserve the evil system of segregation. Over the last few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolent demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. All right, nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. So I've tried to make it clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. T.S. Eliot has said that there is no greater treason than to do the right deed for the wrong reason. So Then he goes on to talk about the jeering and hostile mobs and the horrible traveling on the road where you can't sleep at a hotel and you have to sleep in the car, and all of this, the struggles of the people who are protesting this. But he goes on to say, one day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, and thusly carrying our whole nation back to those great walls of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Never before have I written a letter this long. I'm afraid that it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you it would have been shorter if I wasn't sitting here in a narrow jail. Then he goes on to say, he's trying to make peace back with his fellow clergymen. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away, and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities, and in some not-too-distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all of their scintillating beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King, Jr. All right, so that ends the letter from a Birmingham jail, and now I'm going to go back and compare parts of this to Plato's Apology and the Crito. All right, so on page 471, 473, and 474 is where he mentions Socrates directly. So I'm just going to go to each of those, and then I'll be shuffling back and forth to the other two dialogues. So the first place where he mentions Socrates, page 471, starting on the bottom of the left-hand column. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to so dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I just referred to the creation of tension as a part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, we must see the need of having nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So we've got to make a crisis-packed situation to force a negotiation. But let's focus on the reference to Socrates and the idea of being a non-violent gadfly. So we'll go to the Apology, or the defense of Socrates, on page 22. All right, so the left-hand column. So this is Socrates in the courthouse in Athens, defending his life against charges of corrupting the youth and believing in gods of his own invention instead of the gods recognized by the state. That you can find the charges against him on page 17. It's a slightly different translation. The translation is what I've memorized already. All right, so Socrates says, I'm not trying to corrupt anybody. Why would I do that? That'll make the society worse, and I've got to live here. If I'm doing it accidentally. But in fact, I think I was sent by God to force you Athenians to care for your souls and to care for goodness and justice as opposed for wealth and honor and the things of the body. So I'll read, we saw Martin Luther King refer to creating the tension that forces negotiation with the unjust power structure, the same way Socrates did, and then he referred to the gadflies. So page 22, left-hand column. At this point, therefore, fellow Athenians, so far from pleading on my own behalf, as I might be supposed, I am pleading on yours, in case by condemning me you should mistreat the gift which God has bestowed upon you. Because if you put me to death, you will not easily find another like me. The fact is, if I may put the point in a somewhat comical way, that I have been literally attached by God to our city as if to a horse, a large thoroughbred which is a bit sluggish because of its size and needs to be aroused by some sort of gadfly. Yes, in me, I believe God is attached to our city just such a creature, the kind which is constantly alighting everywhere on you all day long, arousing, cajoling, or reproaching each and every one of you. You will not easily acquire another such gadfly, gentlemen. Rather, if you take my advice, you will spare my life. I dare say, though, that you will get angry, like people who are awakened from their doze. Perhaps you will heed Anytus and give me a swat. You could happily finish me off, and then spend the rest of your life asleep, unless God in his compassion for you were to send you someone else. So, Socrates has been harassing the people of Athens his whole life. He's 70 years old. He won't leave people alone. He constantly is interrogating people who are esteemed as wise to prove that they're not wise. He referred to the oracle at Delphi. One of his friends, Chaerephon, said he asked the oracle, which was a priestess in the temple of Apollo, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle said, no, no one's wiser than Socrates. So the oracle speaks for the god Apollo. Socrates says, oh, wait a minute, I know I'm not wise. I'm going to go disprove the god. All I got to do is find someone who's wise. So he went to a politician known for his wisdom, and he said, well, I'll discuss wisdom with this man, and then I'll prove he's wiser than me. But to my surprise, oh, he thought he was wise, but he wasn't. So it turns out I was wiser than him because although neither of us knows much, I know I don't, and he thinks he does. And then he interrogated the poets and the craftsmen, and they all had the same opinion. Because they were good at writing poetry, or they were good carpenters, or whatever their trade was, they thought that made them experts on everything about human wisdom. And so Socrates developed a lot of enemies for teaching them, you're not wise, you think you are, but I know you're not wise because, look, you care for your bodily desires and your wealth and your honor, and you give no concern for the higher nature of your soul. So you should think about that. And he compares himself to a horsefly, a gadfly. Constantly, it's horrible. Down in Southern Maryland, College of Southern Maryland, horseflies, especially if there's cows or horses around, and they are very annoying. So then we saw Martin Luther King say, that's what I'm doing. I am creating creative tension. And there's also a similarity between Athens and the United States of America. Athens, at this time, was a great empire that had just been defeated by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, and so had lost its great shine. Now, the United States of America has not been defeated the way Athens had been, but it was a superpower of the day, Athens. Now, it was in its waning days when Socrates was saying these things, but it's similar to the way Abraham Lincoln is comparing himself to Socrates, like a gadfly of America. Hey, America, look what's going on. There's this horrible racial injustice that's this really bottomless pit of evil. It's not as bad as it was 100 years before when slavery was an open and legal thing, but there's still this horrific segregation, and sent like Socrates to create this tension. All right, so that was the first place where he mentioned Socrates, and the next one is on page 473. So he says, and I'll start up at the top on the right-hand column and work down a couple of paragraphs. He says, I hope you can see the distinction I'm trying to point out between just laws and unjust laws. We talked about that earlier. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law as the rabid segregationist would do. This would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly, not hatefully. And then he says, and with a willingness to accept the penalty, I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law. Of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience, and we saw he mentioned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the early Christians who were eaten by the lions. And then now he says, to a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. All right, so Now we're going to get into some more of the details. Socrates practiced civil disobedience. Now I've got here written on my notes, page 21 from the Apology, the defense of Socrates. And on the right-hand column, near the top, he says, I have the greatest fondness and affection for you, fellow Athenians. That reminded me of when Martin Luther King said, our beloved Southland, even though the beloved Southland had segregated the black community and previously had enslaved them, he still said, my beloved Southland. Athens had just sentenced Socrates to death, but he says, I have the greatest fondness and affection for you, fellow Athenians, but I will obey my God rather than you, and so long as I draw breath and am able, I shall never give up practicing philosophy or exhorting and showing the way to any of you whom I ever encounter by giving my usual sort of message. Excellent friend, I shall say, you are an Athenian. Your city is the most important and renowned for its wisdom and power. So are you not ashamed that while you take care to acquire as much wealth as possible with honor and glory as well, yet you take no care or thought for understanding or truth, or for the best possible state of your soul? Shame on you for setting the lowest value upon the most precious things, and for rating inferior ones more highly. I believe that no greater good has ever befallen you in our city than my service to my God, because all I do is go about persuading you, young and old alike, not to care for your bodies or for your wealth so intensely as for the greatest possible well-being of your souls. All right, so that is the civil disobedience that Socrates advocates, very similar to what Martin Luther King was doing, which is why he mentioned Socrates. One big difference there, however, as you see, Socrates says, I've told you don't care for your bodies, care for your soul. But we saw Martin Luther King on page 477, when responding to other Christian ministers who say, we're not involved with politics and social rights laws, we're dealing with the other world, the heavenly world. And he says, in the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I've heard so many ministers say, those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern, and I've watched so many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which made a strange distinction between body and soul, the sacred and the secular. Socrates definitely makes that strange distinction. And nevertheless, he's advocating the same kind of civil disobedience that Martin Luther King is emulating. There is one big difference, though. Martin Luther King openly violated the law against parading in the public place without a permit, whereas Socrates hadn't actually disobeyed any laws. He said, if you were to pass a law that forbade me from practicing philosophy, I would break it, but they hadn't passed that law. He was brought up on charges of corrupting the youth and believing in gods of his own invention, which that law, he's saying, wouldn't be inherently unjust. The idea of believing in gods other than the city gods, he probably would have. He probably did believe in his own idea of God and not the idea of the gods of Mount Olympus preached by the city. But he definitely thought, if you actually corrupt the youth, yeah, then you're guilty. But who would do that on purpose? You should be educated, not punished. And, all right, so, and he believed, though, like Martin Luther King, that he's doing God's work. God sent him to that city, and that's why he's going to stay there and keep philosophizing, even if they kill him. Martin Luther King was of the same opinion. As a matter of fact, I was looking online to see what he would say about death, and the Dr. King's speech about Not Afraid to Die, 1963. This is just something I got off YouTube here. So while he was in Alabama, and there's a video recording of it, but the audio is really bad, he says, when I say don't be afraid, do you know what I really mean? Don't even be afraid to die. All right, so he's definitely aware that you could die if you start speaking out against the injustices of the mob. And that's a big point that Socrates also makes, and we're going to go on to discuss that. I'm just hoping I don't turn this video off. Okay. So that was another place, and I went to the Apology 21. If you pass a law telling me not to philosophize, I'd break it. Now I'm going to turn to the Crito, page 38. And this is about civil disobedience and breaking the laws. And what would Socrates say, comparing it to Martin Luther King? All right, now here's a big difference. Socrates, his friend Crito, visits Socrates in the jailhouse in Athens. And he's saying, Socrates, you've got to escape. What are people going to say? They're going to say, Crito, you're Socrates' oldest friend. You could have easily bribed the guards to get him out of jail, and you didn't. And so, Socrates, you got to get out. And furthermore, what are you going to do? Drink the poison and die and leave your children here? You got 3 sons, 2 little ones, and an older one, and a wife. That's not just. So don't worry about me and the consequences of bailing you out. Let's just get you out of here right now. And he's in a hurry, and he's pushing Socrates. Socrates says, okay, hold on. Let's think about this. If me escaping tonight is just, let's do it. But if it's not just, then we won't do it. And, all right, so with that little preface, Socrates, in explaining to Crito why he shouldn't leave and escape from the jail, he takes on the personality of the laws of Athens, and he speaks as if he's the personified laws. He says, please, this is what the laws are telling him in Crito as they try to escape. This is the hypothetical scenario he's running through. Please tell us, Socrates, what do you have in mind with this action you are attempting to do? Do you intend anything short of destroying us, the laws, and the city as a whole, to the best of your ability? Do you think that a city can still exist without being overturned if the legal judgments rendered within it possess no force, but are nullified or invalidated by individuals? And we saw that's what Martin Luther King was saying. He's saying, in no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law as the rabid segregationist would do. This would lead to anarchy. So he's admitting what the laws personified are telling Socrates. If you just decide, I'm going to disobey that law, that's the beginning of the end of society. So then, what shall we say, Crito, in answer to that and other such questions? He goes, shall we tell them, yes, that is our intention, to escape, because the city was treating us unjustly by not judging our case correctly. Is that to be our answer, or what? Crito says, indeed it is, Socrates. Socrates, and what if the laws say, and was that also part of the agreement between you and us, Socrates, or did you agree to abide by whatever judgments the city rendered? All right, so this is where Socrates, he's not really diverging from Martin Luther King, because Martin Luther King talks about my beloved Southland, and he's praising the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If you read the American Dream and the most sacred values and of our Judeo-Christian heritage, and thusly carrying our whole nation back to those great walls of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Martin Luther King respects the legal structure of the United States of America, and he makes a point that if you're going to break an unjust law, then you should accept your punishment freely so as to avoid anarchy, which is a big point that Socrates is making to Crito. And so the laws say, we're your parents. We were in charge of the marriage laws that led to your creation. We provided your education because, so the marriage laws led to his creation. Then they educated him because the education laws say you have to educate your children. So we're more important to you than your own mother and father. And very good, in view of your birth, upbringing, and education, can you deny first that you belong to us as our offspring and slave, as your forebears also did? So Socrates is considering himself a slave of the laws, and that you have to do whatever they tell you. But he'll go on to say that the laws will tell him, you can try to persuade us, but if you can't, then you have to do what we tell you to do. That you shouldn't respond unjustly to an unjust attack. And I'm going to get to that too, the whole nonviolent aspect. So continuing on page 39, he says, you must either persuade it or else do whatever it commands. This is the laws personified telling Socrates how he must treat his fatherland. You must either persuade it or else do whatever it commands. And if it ordains that you must submit to certain treatment, then you must hold your peace and submit to it. Whether that means being beaten or put in bonds, or whether it leads you into a war to be wounded or killed, you must act accordingly, and that is what is just. You must neither give way, nor retreat, nor leave your position. Rather, in warfare, in court, and everywhere else, you must do whatever your city or fatherland commands, or else persuade it as to what is truly just. And if it is sinful to use violence against your mother or father, it is far more so to use it against your fatherland. And then the laws will go on to say, furthermore, we let you go wherever you want. If you don't like it here, leave. There's no law against you leaving, but you've chosen to stay here for 70 years. Furthermore, you've raised children and you leave the city less than anybody else. You only leave Athens when you have to go fight in a war campaign. So you've tacitly shown that you love the city, you stayed here, you didn't leave. So now you have to accept our laws, even if they hurt you. You have the opportunity to persuade us, but if you can't, then just endure your punishment. And then the laws say, and you will have been treated unjustly, not by us laws, but by human beings. So it's the human beings applying us just laws unjustly. And then, all right, so I went over the details in another video about the Crito. I'm just trying to compare this to Martin Luther King. So that was on page 470. Let me go look over here. All right, that was okay, so that was on page 473. Martin Luther King is saying, if you break the law, then lovingly do it, accept your punishment, and arouse the conscience of your community. All right, so what is the other, page 474, he makes his last reference to Socrates. And this I went over earlier, and he's saying, now he's writing this letter to his fellow clergymen. He says, in your statement, you asserted that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But can this assertion be logically made? Isn't this like condemning the robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical delvings precipitated the misguided popular mind to make him drink the hemlock? All right, so there he mentioned Socrates again. Now, those were the three places where he mentioned Socrates, and I want to get into a little bit more detail about some of the philosophical similarities. Really, the major difference in the discussion question. All right, so this entire video for our class, so it applies to exam 5. Part B, number 6, what is King's defense of his actions in Birmingham? So part B, that's a 100-word essay. You can certainly get 100 words out of what we've gone over in this video. But the more important question is from discussion number 7. In Module 11, discussion number 7, you've got two different options for the discussion post. Option 2 says, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned Socrates 3 times. In what ways are Dr. King's defense of his political strategy of civil disobedience similar to and different than Socrates' defense of his own form of civil disobedience as described by Plato in the Apology and the Crito from part 1 of our book? All right, so use quotes from the book to support your answer. So we've gone over the 3 places where Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned Socrates directly, and I want to get into a little bit more of the details. What I was saying is the only major difference is that Martin Luther King does not believe in the separation or the distinction between body and the soul. He says that on page 477, the left-hand column. Socrates makes a big point about that. He's not saying he's certain that the soul lives after the body dies. It might just be a dreamless sleep, but he's more inclined to believe that you continue to another world, to Hades, where you can discuss philosophy with demigods and great heroes and philosophers and tragic poets. It'll be a great thing. I'll probe the people and question them there just like I did here, only we'll never die. So that's the big difference. Martin Luther King, being a Baptist Christian, I'm assuming that he didn't believe the soul is separate from the body, but that the body will be risen from the grave when Jesus returns, as described in the book of Revelations or the Apocalypse. So it's a huge philosophical difference, but the nonviolent civil disobedience message is almost exactly the same, which isn't surprising considering Martin Luther King was an academic and he openly referred to Socrates 3 times in this important letter. But one thing that they share is suspicion towards and a slight contempt for the opinions of the majority, the mob. So in Martin Luther King's case, the mob was the white segregationists in the South who were creating the crowds and outnumbering the marchers. And their opinion, he wasn't so obviously respectful of. He thought it needed to be totally. It was a pestilence and a festering wound that needed to be exposed to the sun of public opinion. But so I'll go over here where Martin Luther King casts some doubt on the morality of the mob. He says on 471 at the bottom on the right, individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups are more immoral than individuals. All right, so then over on page 473, left-hand column in the middle, let us turn to a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. So he's not, and now I'm going to compare that to some of the places where Socrates disparages the majority opinion. Crito, page 38. Well, let me go to the Apology first. Page 20, 23, and 25. I'll go through these a little quickly. We've already done the major comparisons. This is just a little bit of detail. And he says, I'm going to make sure this video doesn't conk out on me. So on the bottom of the left-hand column, page 20, but enough, fellow Athenians, it needs no long defense, I think, to show that I am not guilty of the charges in Meletus's indictment. The foregoing will suffice. You may be sure, though, that what I was saying earlier is true. I have earned great hostility among many people, and that is what will convict me, if I am convicted, not Meletus or Anytus, but the slander and malice of the crowd. They have certainly convicted many other good men as well, and I imagine they will do so again. There is no risk of their stopping with me. So the crowd killed Socrates, and the crowd, or somebody assassinated Martin Luther King. Certainly there was a huge crowd against him in the South. And he reiterates that point on page 23. The left-hand column starting on the right-hand column at the bottom, page 22. He says, he's talking about the daimon, his inner voice, this voice from God that tells him not to do certain things ever since childhood. Then he goes on to say, that is what opposes my engaging in politics. So he never engaged in politics because his daimon would tell him, don't do it. That is what all right, so, and its opposition is an excellent thing to my mind, because you may be quite sure, fellow Athenians, that if I had tried to engage in politics, I should have perished long since, and should have been of no use either to you or to myself. And please do not get angry if I tell you the truth. The fact is that there is no person on earth whose life will be spared by you or by any other majority, if he is genuinely opposed to many injustices and unlawful acts, and tries to prevent their occurrence in our city. Rather, anyone who truly fights for what is just, if he is going to survive for even a short time, must act in a private capacity rather than a public one. Okay, Martin Luther King chose a public role, and true to Socrates' prediction, he was destroyed by the majority. Assumingly. He was assassinated, but at any rate, it seems to be prophetic. Here in 1963, Martin Luther King is referring to Socrates 3 times, and he's referring specifically to the dialogues where Socrates was executed and by the unjust majority who don't like being told that they are unjust. And that leads to the gadfly. Socrates compares himself to a gadfly. I've been sent by God to harass you, to create this tension, to get you to think about justice and goodness and not wealth and honor and things of the body. You could easily swat me as Anytus and Meletus want you to and go back to sleep, but hopefully God will send another gadfly. Plato was probably, while writing that, thinking about himself, because here he is reincarnating Socrates in the form of the dialogues that became the foundation stone for the Western mind. As I mentioned earlier, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas developed the philosophy and cosmology and dogma of the Catholic Church, and they based that largely on Plato's dialogues, and Aquinas also incorporated Aristotle, all of whom we'll be reading later in the book. All right, so Martin Luther King and Plato are both suspicious of the majority. That was another one of their similarities. And, I think that we're going to leave it at that. So for the discussion question, I'll just go over this one last time so you'll know how to apply this. So discussion number 7, module 11, option 2 here. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. mentions Socrates 3 times. In what ways are Dr. King's defense of his political strategy of civil disobedience similar to and different than Socrates' defense of his own form of civil disobedience, as described by Plato in the Apology and the Crito, from part 1 of our book? Okay, so that will be that.